ultimately, the two governments understand that they have a common enemy.
In August, public opinion polls tracking Taiwan's view of the United States showed a decline. That drop's being fueled by doubts triggered by the Trump administration over moves to bring TSMC to the United States as well as its tariffs. Historically, this isn't the first time Taiwan's view of the U.S. has taken a hit. In this week's edition of Taiwan Talk, I'm joined by Stephen Kraft, Chair and Professor of Security Studies and International Affairs at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. He's the author of American Justice in Taiwan, a book that studies an incident that is rarely discussed today.
The book is about the killing of a nationalist officer by an American who was a part of what was called the Military Assistance and Advisory Group. And this sergeant had accused this officer by the name of Liu Ziran of being a peeping Tom, of watching his wife take a shower. And after she tells him what's going on, she steps out of the bathroom. He grabs his pistol, goes outside, and this is where it gets really complicated because then he ultimately kills Liu Ziran. And the question was this a matter of a peeping Tom? There was a lot of speculation in Taiwan. Was this two guys fighting over the same woman? Was this two guys involved in black market activities and having a falling out because supposedly this sergeant was going to be rotated out? And I knew about this from many years ago, but as I was doing research and I was trying to figure out, why is this significant? It's when I began to see the growing tensions between the United States military and to a certain degree our own government versus that of the government of Chiang Kai-shek, because we were wanting the nationalist government to become less dependent economically on the United States. We wanted them to develop Taiwan's market, but that suggested that then would become independent, and the goal would be not to return to the mainland. And we were pressuring them to downsize their military, particularly the army. And again, that suggested that there is no going back. And so the nationalists would keep saying, "What we have to maintain our morale. We have to give our people hope that we're going to go back. And if you force us to make these kind of changes," and so the tensions just grew. And on top of that, there had been this undertow or underlying resentment that the Americans that were living in Taiwan had diplomatic immunity. And there had been this effort on the part of the foreign ministry to get a status of forces agreement, which started to become more common after World War II because the Americans had bases all over the world, and we had signed one with Japan. And so the government felt like, well, you're not treating us as equals. In fact, and you're treating Japan, you're giving them a cell. And I don't know if you understand what a status of force agreement does, but basically, if an American commits a crime while on duty, it's the responsibility of the United States government to deal with that. If it's a crime that was committed off duty, then it should be the jurisdiction of the local government. And so we resisted that. And it won't be until 1965, 1966 that the two sides finally signed an agreement. So this killing on Yang Ming-said, besides the was it really a peeping Tom incident? And on top of that, isn't that an overreaction? On top of that, Americans not only have diplomatic immunity, but they get to arm themselves and they get to take the law in their hands. Now, our position was, well, he's defending his castle and et cetera, et cetera. So all of this, and then of course, when there is a court martial, eventually in the United States, there's 2 or 3 different investigations. We investigate, see nothing to try this individual for. Sergeant Reynolds, his name was Reynolds. The Taiwan government does its own investigation. And then we're forced to do another investigation, and ultimately he's court-martialed, but he's found not guilty. And to the shock of people throughout Taiwan, they don't understand. Wait a minute, he killed someone. You're saying that he's guilty when we all know that he killed someone? And not making matters any better was the United States' refusal to pay an indemnity to the family. Only after the fact does the United States government make that offer? But then it's too late, and so people are angry, and then there's a riot the day after the verdict in which the American embassy in Taipei is basically trashed. And but then it got worse. It moved to the United States Information Service, which was our propaganda arm, and then it moved to a police station, and there the police opened fire, killed a couple of people, and then for a number of days, maybe weeks, there's these tensions, and eventually it passes. It doesn't lead to a break in relations or anything like that. But what my purpose was to talk about the problem of giving U.S. soldiers and their families diplomatic immunity and not understanding the problems that that could cause in a society, particularly when you've got people engaged in speeding, drunkenness, and on and on.
Did the incident contribute to tensions between the US government and the Taiwan government, or between the US government and the people of Taiwan?
I would say it was more, maybe a little more the latter, because ultimately the two governments understand that they have a common enemy. And so we had a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. That treaty remained in effect until 1979, 1980, when Jimmy Carter made the decision to recognize the People's Republic of China and announced that the alliance that had been around since, or mutual agreement had been around since 1954, 55, is going to go. So the relationship stayed intact. It doesn't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean that there were people in this country that were happy. There were politicians who had supported Chiang Kai-shek, and they were rather shocked that there was no effort on the part of the government to crack down on the rioters, the protesters slash rioters until it became an attack on them. So yes, it gives people a bad taste, but I've not sensed or seen anything that would tell me that American public opinion was completely turned off by this event. If anything, it would be the following year when there's another crisis over Jinmen, and there are some real tensions there between our government and Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek's government, and the crisis will eventually lead to Americans thinking, well, I don't know that it's worth fighting a war over Taiwan. But I think maybe for people in Taiwan, I think in some cases they might change, but it didn't last because we know going into the 60s and the 70s, even though that I don't recall any major riots occurring again. And of course, during the Vietnam War, we had this program to send thousands of Americans to Taiwan for what we call the R&R plan. So in that case, the society essentially welcomed them. So as far as I can tell, there was no long-lasting damage done to the relationship or to how Taiwanese felt about Taiwanese and, of course, mainlanders who had come to Taiwan after 1945, 49. I don't know that that had long-lasting impact on how people felt.
There seems to be a resurgence of US skepticism in Taiwan. Would you say that that incident or other incidents that have happened in the past have fueled this US skepticism here? Or would you say that the two events are fairly disconnected?
I would say the riots are disconnected. What is connected would be how the United States never took, for example, a Taiwanese independence movement very seriously. Although after World War II, there was some discussion, particularly by 1948, 49, after the February 28th incident, there were Americans who said, maybe we need to rethink giving Taiwan back to China because the situation has changed. Ultimately, there's a Chinese Communist government coming to power, et cetera, et cetera. But eventually, by January 1950, that's all that debate within the government is killed by President Truman saying Taiwan belongs to China. And the only thing that helps the situation in Taiwan is the invasion of Korea by the North, and then the United States changes its policy toward Taiwan. But up to that point, there had been talking about, oh, should we rethink the Cairo Declaration? And by 1950, should Taiwan become part of the United Nations or be a United Nations trusteeship? Didn't happen. So people who were members of the movement, which there were few, They were thinking, well, we've got hope. Maybe the UN will take on our situation. Didn't happen. Well, maybe when they signed the treaty with Japan in 1952 to bring about the surrender, maybe we can rethink what's going to happen to Taiwan. Didn't happen. And then after that, like for example, when Peng Ming is arrested and then eventually he's allowed to leave Taiwan and he settles in the United States, by the early 70s, the Nixon administration doesn't even understand the Taiwan independence movement and is like, well, Taiwanese are Chinese. What's the problem here? So, and for people like Peng Ming and others, they're going to be disappointed because the Nixon administration he goes to China. And then eventually that leads to the ending of the alliance. So it hurts the government, the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek and ultimately Jiang Jingguo, but also it hurts the Taiwanese independence movement, which just could not make any headways with past governments. I could see from a historical perspective that, Ronald Reagan went into office saying no more Taiwan, but that didn't change anything. Bill Clinton allowed Lee Teng-hui to go to Cornell. And I was in Taiwan when this happened. We put a couple of aircraft carriers in the area in the crisis of 94 and 95 and 96. I was there. But it wasn't no time that Bill Clinton's talking about the three no's with regard to Taiwan. No independence, for example. No Taiwan in the United Nations or in international, nation-based international organizations. And then after 9/11, the Bush administration did not want Chen Shui-bian talking about independence or referendums or anything. So time and time again, the most hope that people from Taiwan may have had in the last 10 years was the phone call between Taiwan and Trump. And now, if I was in Taiwan, I'm sure I would be skeptical. So from a historical perspective, if you've been a supporter of Taiwan independence, the United States has not given you a lot of reason to feel that it's going to support you and back you if you make that decision to say, okay, we're no longer a Republic of China, we're a Republic of Taiwan. That's why I think historically speaking, there's reason to be skeptical.
Where do you see relations between Taiwan and the US going from here? There's been a lot of shifting sands, as it were, and I'm fairly certain that what's happened in with the South Koreans in Georgia would have fueled an additional layer of skepticism, perhaps, or unease with regard to the security of its TSMC investment. What do you think about that?
Well, I think they should, someone has already brought that up on social media somewhere that, is this going to happen to TSMC in Arizona? That so far that hasn't happened. I don't think anyone expected for ICE to go into a Hyundai factory and arrest over 300 South Koreans. I don't think Hyundai expected this. I don't think South Koreans expected this. So for an ally who had welcomed this plant to do this, and in this case, though, we demanded that TSMC be brought to the United States. But if you are from Taiwan and you are working for a company like that, there is nothing to give anyone who is from Taiwan any real reason to believe they're going to be protected, even if they have a green card. They could be arrested or detained and questioned and possibly deported. So I would imagine that the government in Taiwan is uneasy, and I imagine it's really stuck in a tough place. It's got this growing power right in front of it and flying around it all the time, sailing around it, and on and on and on. And then you had this one power who we still have bases and things like that, Okinawa, Korea, whatever. And you're trying to build relations, but you don't know what your major ally is going to do because they are so unpredictable. I would think in Taiwan, the government may feel like more and more we need more friends. We need to diversify our friends, much as I remember we talked about this in the 90s about Taiwan diversifying its economy. There were times when people would say we should not be too reliant on the United States, but then it would go back, we should not be too reliant on China. But so I would think the government is going to have to figure out what are we going to do if we're just by ourselves? Japan, Philippines, the United States. um, the NATO powers, they decide, what if they're going to help us? What are we going to do? Do we just focus on our defense? Do we diversify our friends? I think Taiwan, though, it has to be thinking about that very seriously.
You were listening to Stephen Kraft of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And that does it for this week's edition of Taiwan Talk. I'm Hope Go. Thank you for tuning in.